we don't need roads.
Guys, I love both of these movies. I've been begging for this interview since X came out earlier this year. So seriously, thank you so much for taking the time.
Right on, man.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to jump into this because I got 1,000 questions for you. I actually rewatched X the night before I saw Pearl, and there were so many lines that stood out to me, like Pearl telling Maxine that she has a special face and Pearl telling Howard that she's always hated blondes. I feel like actors and storytellers often use the past to help tell a new story, but how do you use, I guess, the future and what's to come to tell a new story?
Yeah, absolutely. All the prep that I did for older Pearl in X, as well as Maxine, I kind of brought with me during my prep for younger Pearl in Pearl, and it was immensely helpful.
I don't know, it's an interesting thing to go into making X knowing we were going to make Pearl. So I always kind of just looked at it as one big movie that almost had like just a big gap in the middle. So I mean, I was always joking with everybody that the blonde situation that happens to Bobby Lynn on the dock was a long way to go for a one-liner joke, but but worth it nonetheless.
You know, what I do love about X is that it's so much a love letter to like 70s horror movies, particularly Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is one of my favorite movies ever. So I'm watching Pearl and I just can't shake this feeling. And I'm sorry if this is crazy, that it feels like a love letter to Wizard of Oz. Like there's a scarecrow, and at one point Pearl looks just like the Wicked Witch of the West when she's on the bike, and the sister-in-law feels like Glinda. And it's like, am I crazy to pick up on Wizard of Oz vibes while I'm watching this?
I mean, I don't think you're crazy. I mean, all those things are in the movie for sure. So I mean, I think it was less literally informed probably than in which you're phrasing it, but it's not lost to me that we were making a sort of Technicolor inspired 1940s movie that happened to have a scarecrow. I mean, it has a different let's say she has a different interaction with the scarecrow than Dorothy does. But yeah, I mean, it was really, there's a element of evoking this kind of era of filmmaking and the sort of wonder that came with that kind of filmmaking and a sort of fantasy to that, and there's a childlike nature to that, or certain Disney movies of the era and things like that. And it felt like an interesting contrast for a much darker story.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to cut you guys loose on this. You guys have honestly only made me want more stories from this timeline. So like, prepare for me to beg for more sequels for the rest of my life and the rest of your careers. How many more people do you think Pearl has killed between the events of Pearl and X? And another question I'm actually afraid to ask is Maxine going to be okay? Because like, I'm actually genuinely afraid as to like what happens to her after the events of X.
I think it's a wild ride.
One of my favorite moments for people when they see Pearl is that when she goes to the audition, almost everybody that I've talked to is like really rooting for her, despite the fact that she's murdered a bunch of people. And most of those people have seen X and know she's going to murder more people. But you're like, yeah, but I still want her to get the part and do great, And I think that's a real testament to Mia's performance and the relatability to a character that you really shouldn't probably relate to that much. And I think the same thing with Maxine is like Maxine when at the end of X, when we leave off with her, she's had a rough road, and you can't necessarily say she's done the greatest of things at the time either. But you still want it to work out for her. So I think that hopefully it works out better than it did for Pearl. I hope so. I hope she's okay. It's a.
Where we're going, we don't need roads.